Michelle, are you going to be ready to go live at? Okay. Okay. Good afternoon. Sunny, and I think it's pretty beautiful outside. Beautiful near spring day in New York. Thank you for all of you who are joining us on Zoom, and for all of our observers who are joining us on YouTube. Today is day 2 of our first week-long plenary of 2022. Today we're focusing on agenda item 3, listed entities in PI. This is a project being done very much in coordination with our friends at IAASB. Just to note, we will have from time to time, I think during our session today, a few IAASB guests, including Andrew Mincer, the PI working group chair, and Ken and Jeff from the IAASB team may be joining us as well throughout this discussion. So we're in great shape here. The idea will be to consider both the feedback that we've gotten from CAG, the SMBG, offline board comments, and most importantly, your comments made at this session. And again, as I said yesterday, if you have significant comments or concern, regardless of what has been said in offline comments, we need to get them on the record and to allow us to have a discussion on it. The hope today is to approve, get comments to allow us to approve the project proposal next week. So please make your comments, and then to put us in a position to approve a narrow scope exposure draft in June. So I'm gonna hand it over to Josephine and let her lead the conversation today.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone. As always, I first want to thank Kalina and Natalie for all their hard work, particularly over this weekend, last weekend, and the working group, Chun-Wei, on screen on the television for us, and Denise and Dan are in the room, and Denise, I believe, has flown in especially for this particular presentation today, so we must make sure that we keep her nice and happy. Of course, I must give credit to Jeff and Ken and the IAASB PI Task Force for their support in helping us shape our project proposal. I do want to thank the board members who sent in comments ahead of time. We really got very, very few comments, and we got a couple of emails, well, more than a couple, a few emails of supporting the project and looking forward to approving it next week. So if we could just move to the first slide, we actually have an agenda slide today, and that's because we have, I thought you were waving at me, Natalie. I thought I've just started. I've already said something wrong. All right, so we've got a couple of things to do today. So we've got obviously the project proposal, and we'll go through that. And then we want to kickstart track 1 and roll up our sleeves basically and get your feedback on those disclosures and the different options. Then, of course, on Monday, you'll get an updated project proposal, and hopefully then we'll be able to turn that. And then Wednesday is our approval day, as Tom has already mentioned. So that's where we are. So I'll do, as I did yesterday, I'll first go through the CAG comments, and then I'll go through, which also cover as well, both the project proposal and the options discussion. And then I'll go through the SMPAG comments, and then we'll go through some of the observations that we received from the board members. Okay, so if I could have the next slide, please, Michelle, thank you. So as you can see, there was strong support from the CAG for the project proposal, and particularly the 2-track approach. It was suggested that this approach will actually address the priority of disclosure of enhanced transparency, so it was important to get that started first. The CAG commented on the importance of aligning the terminology, but there was a caution by one CAG member that we shouldn't, by doing that, be creating new requirements. And then there was also support for addressing the differential requirements, and there was caution that the timeline of track 2 appears awfully long. And so there was encouragement for the IAASB to be slightly more effective with our resource allocation. Next slide, please. I'm missing my slide options. Upside down, sorry. Okay, so the CAG also went through the second part of the issues paper and talked about the options for clarifying ISA 700. There was lots of support for presenting a couple or three options in an exposure draft. We got feedback on option 1 and option 2. We had mixed views on those options. Option 1 actually had the most support, and it was preferred as it was seen to provide more transparency and consistency in reporting globally. Why some others preferred option 2 was because it doesn't actually impose more onerous obligation, which would of course be imposed by the code. So it doesn't go beyond what the code requires. And then there was little support for option number 3. Some thought it wasn't really a viable alternative. It would lead to less consistency and transparency. And some actually suggested that we should remove option 3 altogether when presenting options and only focus on the actual requirements, because that's what the questions are about, whether that disclosure should be required in the auditor's report. Jim, at this point, that's really the feedback that I had written down to present to the board. Was there anything else that you feel we should mention?
Well, once again, you have done a stellar job of keeping good notes on the CAG meetings. I'm going to invite you every time. But I guess two things come to my mind is there really wasn't much support for option 3, which you have up there, little support, but I think that was a clear communication from the CAG at large. And then the second part is I had a note in my notes about complexity and trying to make sure as you move forward that the changes do not create additional complexities.
Thank you. Okay, Michelle, next slide, please. Thank you. So the SMP AG support the project proposal and the 2-track approach, and they agreed that convergence between the IAASB and IAASB's key concepts is important, highly desirable, in fact. They said that you do need to think about a scalable approach when addressing differential requirements, and of course that is part of that process as we go through that process, assuming of course the project proposal is approved. They did agree with the objective to address differential requirements. They did suggest that when we're going through this process as well, that we don't drive any perception that audits of non-PI entities are of lesser quality. So we have to make sure we keep that now on our hints and tips page, which is now being created as I go along for our PI project. And then we have to also give some clarity if non-PI auditors voluntarily adopt those stricter independent requirements for PIs, so they're not required to, but they choose to voluntarily adopt them. Do they then need to report that in the auditor's report? Now, I had actually managed to catch Jeff today because I do understand in terms of the IAASB code, if you are voluntarily applying those independence requirements and it's not a PI entity, then the disclosure is still part of those requirements, and the auditor would then need to publicly disclose that fact. So it's really more of a matter for IAASB from the SMP AG's perspective. And then, of course, the mechanism for disclosure is what we're going to be discussing as part of track 1. And I think that was it. So, yeah, if we could move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so you're used to this pick your favorite number slide now. So as I say, overall, very small number of written comments and, very much appreciated, of course. And so as of yesterday, the working group also will need to noodle over some of these comments and also some of the suggestions that we might make today. So just a few things to point out in terms of the grayed out text. Again, we did have only a very small number of edits to that grayed out text, but of course, as with yesterday, the wording has been carried over from the full project proposal. So it's already been deliberated and agreed by the IAASB. In terms of number 2, one member raised their concern again with the terminology financial condition in IAASB's overarching objective, which we're adopting. and that financial condition is, of course, broader than the audit of the financial statements. I'm sure you recall that from our sort of July and October meetings as well. But IAASB did actually discuss this at the December meeting, or it may have been earlier, but and they did agree to address the members' concern. And so what they've done is brought in extra language to 400.10 probably, I think. Yes, 400.10. Thank you, Natalie. Yeah. And have it also explained this point further in the basis for conclusion. That member did suggest, however, though, depending on where our objectives and guidelines land, it might be necessary for us to also reiterate what IAASB have actually reiterated in their basis for conclusion on this matter as well. And I thought that was actually a good idea. So thank you for that. In terms of the objectives, and if you recall, the objectives are actually the key public interest issues that we had already discussed and the board broadly agreed with in October. Having said that, we did get a couple of comments on objective B. So you'll find objective B, and we'll talk about the objectives as well. And so when we talk about the objectives, when we get to that question, then it would be good to actually get the board's feedback on these couple of points I'm going to raise. So the comments were that B lacks clarity and that the word addressing is a little bit vague. It doesn't make sense. And whilst implicit in objective B that out of this particular objective, we will be creating objectives and guidelines. I'm sorry, I have to use the word objective twice here. I'm trying not to confuse everybody, but even though it's implicit in the project objective B, they believe it should actually be explicit. So we should have a different objective that just addresses the objective and the guidelines. And then, of course, later, we actually then saw a couple of comments on the actions that were in the proposed actions. And one of the pieces of feedback that came back on that is that they were difficult in some cases to understand because they weren't aligned clearly with the objectives. So Colleen, Natalie and I thought that actually that member's comment, or those members' comment on actually making those into two objectives rather than just the one, might also help deal with some of the issues people have understanding how the actions line up with the objectives. So a thought for when we get into that particular question, would you support separating that? Well, it's not actually separating it, but creating a new objective that specifically deals with the objectives and guidelines, and then we'll have B as it is, but we will need to address B as well in terms of the word addressing. One caution, of course, is that as we were walking through this and talking about this, we felt that some of these changes might make these objectives more action-oriented rather than outcome-based, but that's just something to keep in mind. And then in terms of objective C, again, I mean, it was supported in October, but a board member made the comment that it indicates, and this was a general comment and it was a fair comment, that it does indicate here and in other places in the project proposal that the auditor's report as being the mechanism is now predetermined. And that wasn't our intention. Our intention is that we will obviously put out an exposure draft and then we'll have a consultation on the matter and we'll get feedback. So we agreed that we need to go through the project proposal and make sure that any words that suggest that the auditor's report is predetermined or it's a definite, that we need to tidy those up, determine the extent to which. We're all used to that kind of language. So we will look at that as well. And then the next point was on the key issues, just a couple of little ones on the key issues. There was a suggestion to extend A, which is about increased complexity and inconsistent application, by adding inconsistent understanding as well. And so when we get to the key issues, board members' comments on that extension would be welcome. And then there was a question as to whether there's a missing issue in respect to the case-by-case analysis. And I must admit, that didn't really quite make sense to us because the action is the case-by-case analysis. And our perspective here is the issue as to whether or not we don't actually perform that activity. So what are the problems that will happen? What could go wrong? Sounds a bit like ISO 315 now, but what could go wrong if we don't actually have those differential we don't evaluate those differential requirements. So that's why we believe what we have for B is right. But again, comments on that are welcome. In terms of issue C, that's another place specifically where it suggests that the auditor's report is a definitive here. So we'll have a look at that and reword that one as well. And now we're on to the proposed actions. There are only a couple of comments on the proposed actions, which I've already talked about, which is, first of all, some of it was a little bit confusing because it didn't quite line up with the objectives. And then can we just make sure we're not using definitive language in terms of the auditor's report? And then on the timeline, number 6, there was concern expressed that 90 days may not be sufficient. I mean, we're still of the view here that this is going to be a very small consultation with very little explanatory material, and it's only suggesting proposals to change ISO 700. And of course, if you're in agreement, potentially as well, ISO 260. And to that extent, it's not major revision. It's incredibly targeted and narrow. So we still feel that 90 days would be appropriate in that case, but of course, all open to debate today. So if we could move to the next slide. Question number 1, our favorite question number for the week so far. So we're going to deal now with the subject and the introduction. So you're looking at section 1, please, and section 2, and if you have any comments on those. Thank you. Thank you, Tom.
Okay. I'll invite comments. Is that your 10 up, Isabel?
Yes, so hello everybody. Bonjour, as it is the first time I'm speaking this week. Very happy to be back with you in the boardroom. I support the project, and I want to thank the task force and the staff for this paper that is really easy to read and easy to go through. And I have some comments on the subjects that in fact relate to the scope, but as they are fundamental for the project, I want to raise them up front and not wait to part 6. First of all, I noted that IAASB has revised part 4A of the code and not part 4B. So, of course, we should not touch ISAE and ISRS because they are covered by part 4B of the code. So we should acknowledge that somewhere in the paper, because that's quite obvious. Part 4A that has been modified by IAASB deals with audit and review. So then the question is, should we deal with review? And I noted that in part 4A, and we can see that in page 11 of 12 of the glossary, agenda item 3B. And on page 11 of 12, there's an extract of the glossary. And the glossary defines the term audit. And it says that in part 4A of the code, the term audit applies equally to review. So then my question is whether the request for transparency that we have in paragraph R400-20, which says in performing the audit, applies also to review, because it's in part 4A. And therefore, do we need to expand the scope of the transparency requirement to review reports? So that was my point. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Josephine. Similar to Isabel, strong support for the project. In this particular section, the question I had was really relating to objective B, and in several places in the proposal, we talk about the objective being to meet heightened expectations of stakeholders regarding the performance of audit engagements for certain entities. And I thought that seemed to be a very broad kind of objective, given that what we're really focusing in on is where there are heightened expectations regarding the independence of the firm performing the audit engagements. So I wondered if it would be better to rescope that objective to make it clear that it's audited engagements where there are heightened expectations regarding the independence of the firm, rather than just performance of audit engagements as a whole for certain entities.
Okay, Eric, I think that's the next section we're going to do. So if we don't respond to that here or don't generate conversation, we'll just table that for a moment, okay? Kaiue.
Thanks, Tom, and good evening, Josephine. Thanks very much for the presentation and for the work within the working group. Thank you very much. I have no comments of fundamental importance, and I agree with the content of this project proposal. I very much believe that this proposal is in the public interest. Thanks, that's all.
Thank you, Kai. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. Excellent paper, Josephine and the working group. I like the consistency in the framework to fraud and going concern with the grayed out paragraphs. And I only had one comment in this section, and that was in the subject in paragraph 2, where I had previously, before I heard Isabel speak, agreed to scope out ISRE and ISAE, but I also wanted to ask, similar to the going concern, what about ISA 800? And that is my only comment.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. I see no other hands up. So really, back to you, Josephine, on the question of scoping here.
Well, actually, to be fair, I can't answer that question because I'm not savvy enough with the code to suggest that when they develop these, it extended to review. And I don't remember it coming up in conversation. So I have, to be fair, I've gone down the track that we are only talking about audits of entities that are PIs and not reviews. So I don't think Jeff is online yet with us, or I know that at one point they were going to join, but we might have to hold that one and speak to our IAASB colleagues about that one. But yes, it's a good point, good question. Thank you, Isabel and Wendy, for that. So we do need to clarify that. In terms of, oh, and then Eric will deal with your comment when we get to project. Yeah, okay, fine, thank you.
It's a good segue.
Next slide, please. Okay, so for the project objectives, just a reminder then, because I do go through it very quickly, thoughts about whether B could be separated, well, not separated, I keep saying that, it's not separated, but whether that implicit piece about developing objectives and guidelines should be its own objective in its own right. And also, we do take on the comment that C was too definitive, and so we could take that away with a working group and noodle over better wording for that one. So comments on the objectives, please.
Okay. Edo.
Yes, thank you, Tom. And the working group and Josephine, or led by Josephine, many thanks for the paper. I appreciate you've addressed a fair bit of the comments that I provided ahead of the meeting, but some of them I'll make regardless, and that is that I agree with to the greatest extent possible to converge, but I think you're aware of my reservations with the changes that IAASB made in putting public interest on the financial condition and financial well-being, and that seems to drive potentially a differential requirements toward that specific fact, and I need to be careful. We need to be careful with it because it's financial statements audit we're after, and not that particular element. You've also discussed a potential solution to it, so I look forward to how we could then bring that in. And then in respect of objective B, just wanted to make the point that when it talks about differential requirements, I thought that scope would be the existing differential requirements rather than a broader all over differential requirements, because that could be a very large scope project. So if you could make that clear, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Edo. Sue?
Thanks. Thanks, Josephine and the team. And thank you for your kind of bingo sheet of the things that people have raised. That was it's very encouraging to see the sort of proposed thoughts on some of those areas, and particularly the predetermined piece was one that I think we highlighted a few. I was probably one of the people who raised a comment on objective B as well. I would support certainly taking a look at it as to how it can be perhaps a little bit clearer. And I think we were certainly reflecting on how you would just work out what the distinct actions were to achieve that objective. So I certainly support the further reflection. Thanks.
Thank you. Warren?
Thanks, and good evening, everybody. Just with respects to the project objectives in paragraph 17, also on point B, just to iterate the point that those differential requirements could end up creating all sorts of additional unintended audit implications, which we can probably talk about in more detail when we get to the action section. But then specifically also on this issue of enhancing transparency under the objective of supporting the public interest, I just wonder if it's a case of transparency being the primary consideration when it comes to disclosing all of these additional independence requirements, and if we think the public interest could be served by other means. In other words, is the disclosure being provided going to provide sort of more relevant, more insightful information into how the audit is being conducted, how risks are understood, how independence issues are being managed, or is it a case of really just wanting to deal with this perceived or actual transparency deficiency?
Thank you, Warren. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. For 17A, agree with the convergence and term concept to clean it up to avoid dueling definitions. We believe the goal of narrow scope convergence should, I believe the scope of narrow scope convergence should simplify and caution unintended consequences, which is similar to what Jim had said earlier, or somebody else said earlier about not having two levels of not making it seem like non-PI is a lesser audit or has lesser requirements. For B, I heard two comments already on B, and I had similar concerns. It seemed very broad, and I was hard pressed to connect the high expectations and confidence to what the intent was, but I think I heard some proposed changes, so I'll wait to see those. And for C, support transparency with IAASB, and I'll say now that support model 1 and 2, didn't think 3 should be part of the exposure draft, and thought we should also offer potential for respondents to the exposure draft to be the response to be able to give other alternatives if they thought there were other alternatives to model 1 and model 2. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Wendy. We'll turn to the options, I think, when we get to the ED, but we'll just note that we park your view. Julie?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Josephine and team. On the project objectives, and I'm thinking about this because this project's a little bit different than some of our other projects in that this project really came about because of the IAASB code change as opposed to something that we went out and got consultation on and asked about. So when I first read the objectives in little a, I wondered if that was more of an overarching objective and B and C sort of fell underneath it. But then I'm wondering if maybe I'm just reading the term key concepts wrong. And is it key concepts, or is that meant to be the sort of definitions and things in the two standards and making sure they align? And if it's the latter, then I understand little a little bit better, because when I was thinking about little a, I was almost thinking that's key concepts being everything within the project as opposed to just the terminology. So it could just be my misunderstanding of the words. In little b, I personally would like the offer you made around thinking about the objectives and guidelines separately. I think that makes sense. And I think you have it in the key action items below. And I think it's, in my view, important as part of this project. So my vote would be to separate that out. And yeah, that's all I had on that piece.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to echo my support for the idea of the breaking out the objectives and guidelines separately. I think that would be help the clarity of the document as a whole.
Diane?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Josephine and the team. I had very few comments on the entire paper. Relative to paragraph 17, I just want to agree with some earlier comments. I do think B is a bit broad, and I do support any efforts to really hone in on the independence elements, because I think that's really what we want to focus on. I was fine with A and C. Thanks.
Thank you. No one else has their hands up. Back to you, Josephine.
Okay. Right. So let's thank you for the support. So we will, I think we've heard fairly clearly now that we'll have a look at separating and developing a new requirement in terms of the objectives and guidelines. So thank you for that. In terms of aligning the greatest extent possible, Ado, that's going to go in our hints and tips paper. That won't necessarily hit the project proposal. So I just wanted to, okay, that's fine, nodding in agreement. In terms of transparency, Warren, we do think it's both. It's both IAASB and IAASB, because we will have enhanced transparency in our audit report, which belongs to us as a board, about the independence requirements that are being applied in that audit. So we do think that enhanced transparency from that perspective is right. And we actually had that conversation, I think, in the October board meeting as well. So we're fairly comfortable with that. And in terms of differential requirements and the impact of that, that's really part of the project. So the key here is, are we happy to go ahead to make that case by case analysis? And that's what we heard, and that's what we got support for. So as we then develop our ideas around that, we will be thinking about the impact, of course. Julie, in terms of A, I think it's both. And because when the alignment is from the IAASB's project objectives, which was set a while back, which we agreed to, and that was the key thing, that between us we would align our key concepts, our ideas, our definitions. So to that extent, that's why we feel it. And as a consequence of that project, we're also doing this case by case analysis. We just thought it would be easier, and perhaps easier to understand, if we focus on the alignment being about, well, essentially we're taking on those definitions. And then it's a little bit like the going concern, that there is some overlap, but then again, as you're moving forward and thinking about case by case, it is as a result of that. So the only thing I would say is that depending on where we land with a case by case analysis, will dictate whether or not we adopt those definitions. So it's not that we're going to adopt the definitions and they just sit there and we do nothing with them. So it's sort of a different way of looking at it. Is that okay? Okay. And then thank you, Diane, for your comments about splitting out. And then Eric, we've actually been using the concept of certain expectations in respect to the performance of audit for quite some time now in our papers. I think we first introduced the idea in November 2020 when we were talking about the fact that, when we were talking about the fact that we have differential requirements. We use listed entity to meet the needs of, the public, certain expectations. So we've sort of carried on with that theme. And then when IAASB updated the code to talk about heightened expectations, their stakeholders, we then use that heightened expectations language in terms of the performance of audit. So it's been with us and part of this project, part of our information and research. Sorry, I'll get my framework for activities corrected for quite some time now. And so hopefully from that perspective, you're fairly comfortable where it sits now.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard some comments about trying to take down the breadth of it a little bit.
Billy?
Yeah, Tom, thank you. I just wanted to come in to support Josephine here. I don't think we can actually narrow it more than what we've narrowed it already. We cannot, independence is the remit of the IAASB. So clearly, when they looked at their objective was formulated in the context of heightened expectations around independence. I do believe that the heightened expectations on our side doesn't just go towards independence. So remember what we said is that back to November 2020 and July 2021 is that the issue came up about, are you creating, from the IAASB side, it was, are you creating different levels of independence? And the argument was, no, we're not creating different levels of independence. We're trying to enhance the confidence in that independence. Now, on our side, we're not worried about independence. We are worried about the consistent performance of quality engagements. So again, on our side, the question will be, are you creating a different level of quality? And the answer is again, no. We are trying to enhance the confidence in that quality. And remember, the idea here is to address two things. The idea is to address current differential requirements, and current differential requirements don't deal with independence. Well, there's one or two, like the statement in ISA 260 that deals with it, but it goes beyond that. And then the idea is also to create, through the objective and guidelines, a framework for us that going forward we will use to help us determine whether we need differential requirements. Now, remember, we also take very seriously the caution from the board, and not just from the board. CAG has also given the same caution that there should not be a proliferation of differential requirements. And very importantly, our differential requirements do not address work effort. Our differential requirements is really, at the moment as they stand, with the exception in ISQM 1 for a specific reason around engagement quality reviews, our differential requirements only address enhanced transparency through communicating with those charged with governance or making specific statements in the auditor's report. It does not address work effort. So I don't want the working group to go back and create an expectation that we can narrow that objective, because I don't think from our perspective we can actually narrow it further than what we did. Remember, we will still be bound by the actions. The scope of the work we will do is still encapsulated in the actions that we will take, and we will limit it to those actions.
Does anyone want to come in? Okay, Billy, I think you've been very persuasive.
Yeah, Billy, would you like the job of the chair of the listed? That was very articulate. Thank you very much. And our lovely Natalie has been doing some research in the background. So I'm going to ask Natalie to come in and hopefully help us solve this audit and review issue that was raised.
Thank you, Josephine. Yeah, so Isabel, to your point about the code in Part 4A, I just had another look there, and yeah, you're correct that obviously it does apply to audit and review engagements, and that they use the term audit. They actually say there that the term audit then applies equally to review engagements and review engagement reports. Having said that, though, if we look at ISRE 2400. We never did update that for the revisions to the auditor's report. So I had a look in there as well. And the reference to relevant ethical requirements in ISO 2400 is very simple. It's just, that the auditor has complied with it says a reference to the practitioner's obligation under this ISRE to comply with relevant ethical requirements. And that's really all it says in 2400. So I guess just really the question is whether we do then expand the scope of the transparency piece to ISRE 2400, taking that into account that we never did update it when we did the auditor reporting revisions.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Isabel. Caught it before we had to do anything about it. But I think personally, I've not had a chance to talk to working group, but perhaps we should just get board members to comment here on what we want to do with this, as we've got this opportunity now.
Okay, anyone want to comment? Isabel, haven't heard what you've heard. Do you have a view on where we should go?
Well, I think if we have a project to align with ISBA code, we will lose an opportunity not to have a full scope revision and not to amend accordingly ISRE. We will have another issue, but you mentioned 2400, but 2410 is even older than that.
Sue?
Yeah, so I had the comment more in relation to 2410 actually, because that's the one that is used most commonly by the kind of entities that we're talking about. So I think, I mean, it's old and we keep putting off doing anything with it, but it does feel, particularly in that space where you are talking about, interim statements where you're then going to have something slightly different in the full audit reports. I think it would be at least good to reflect on, what, if anything, could be done straightforwardly.
I don't think I have much to add to what Sue said. So I think that this should then also be part of this and need to be considered how in the review reports and particularly 2410 this needs to be addressed.
Man?
Yeah, I'm also very supportive, but this is a project proposal, so we'll be very careful that we make sure we set a scope right. But personally, I do support.
This may be an opportunity to use the word explore. No, I'm just, no, but I think there seems to be a general theme that we should explore how it would apply.
Okay, thank you. And that's so we'll go away, Noodle, and think up some appropriate wording to make sure we capture that point. And thanks again, Isabel, for finding that. Okay, so if unless there are any other comments on the project objectives, perhaps we could move on to the next slide, please. Question 1. Question 1, B and C. So as with yesterday, what we'll do is we'll look at the key issues and the actions together if we can. Thank you, Tom.
Okay. Isabel?
Yes, my point is on section 5 key issues and point 23C, but you mentioned it, but just to count me as the people that consider that C is too definitive in saying it's in the auditor's report, while when we go to point 6 in paragraph 28, we say that we will assess whether it can be done in the auditor's report.
Okay, I think the task, the working group is committed to do that, change the language. Sue?
It was building on that point, but looking at action 6, that at the moment is focused on the audit report. And I wondered whether, as you bring in that that consideration of if it's the audit report or if somewhere else, whether to maybe include some kind of reference to describing what the options might be if it's not the audit report. I'm aware that IAASB had some thoughts around things like firms' transparency reports, or if it's in public filings or financial statements, those kind of things, because I think that would then bring more balance to the consultation so that people can see what the range of options might be. Thanks.
Josh?
Thank you, Tom. And this is my first time, so I thank you very much for the great work for Josephine and working groups, especially the Josephine is following the going concern project. So I really appreciate it. I have just one comment about the scope, section 6 scope of the project on listed entity and PI. I agree that effective collaboration between the ESB and the IAASB is very important when considering the introduction of the term publicly traded entity, which is in the definition of PIs in the ESB code, into the ISOs and ISQMs. I am concerned that it may cause unnecessary confusion because of the definition of publicly traded entity differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. For example, Japan has already specific definition of the term publicly traded entity in our Companies Act. So please analysis of jurisdiction to jurisdiction. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Yosh. I see no other hands.
Okay, thank you very much. Sue, I was going to get onto this when we talk about the options, but as it's come up, I might as well mention it now. How we address this in the explanatory memorandum, even if it is short, we will talk about it, and to what extent I'm not quite sure yet. We aren't there yet, and we haven't had a chance to think about that exactly. But we can't offer any other mechanism other than the auditor's report because we have no hooks for those, even like transparency requirement. It is, even ISQM1 is not a mechanism there because that's about communicating about the system of quality management. Julie's nodding and make sure I don't say the wrong thing. And then, websites, for example, we don't have anything there. So I think what needs to be clear in the explanatory memorandum is, we won't use these words, but it's about the fact that this is the mechanism we can offer. And then if this doesn't work, then IASB will have a look at the responses and think about what needs to be done next. So I think that's, but as long as we don't give the impression that the IAASB has other hooks or an ability to create other mechanisms.
I think the thought was that if there are other mechanisms in a particular jurisdiction, for example, that is meeting that objective, then maybe we could be in a position of having something that was conditional, that if it wasn't disclosed elsewhere, for example. So I completely understand what you say, that we have limited tools at our fingertips, but there might be other things jurisdictionally.
Isabel?
Yes, that was to support what Sue has just said. For example, in Europe, we have transparency report where we include the list of PI. So it could be used as the list of clients for which we use the independence requirement for PI. And it may replace adding something in the review report and in the audit report just by having it publicly disclosed elsewhere. So it may work in some jurisdictions, it may not work in some other jurisdictions where you don't have this transparency report, but it will be a discussion we will have in part B of the document. But if there's already a mechanism locally that allows to provide publicly this information, maybe we don't need a requirement to include it in auditor's report because the transparency will be there. But that's a matter for discussion in the next part of the document.
Yeah, I think that it will be a matter for discussion because some of us may have other points of view on this, and I think we should discuss that as a board. Warren?
Thanks very much, Tom. I mean, I take the point that the only real mechanism that we have is the audit reports when it comes to providing additional disclosure. But nevertheless, I mean, based on the last two sets of comments, I really don't see any harm in casting the net a bit wider and eliciting from the stakeholder body whether they foresee alternate mechanisms in addition to some type of modification to the audit report or some type of modification or addition to application guidance. That wouldn't necessarily amount to, creating an alternative or rather an alternate to the audit report, but could necessarily provide some useful practical insights that could be provided to other standard setters, regulators, etc., in tackling this issue of, do we or do we not provide additional disclosure concerning these very sort of niche independent requirements, and what is the best mechanism to actually do that. Really just sort of iterating that point of, rather than going a binary, yes, you modify the audit report, or no, you do nothing. Thanks.
Point noted. I think we do need to, we'll discuss this in the context of the exposure draft document. So I could see some differences of view on this and how we present it. Like, again, I don't think we're seeking to exclude comments, but what's going to be pretty interesting here is that usually in an exposure draft, we indicate a preference. And we're trying to be slightly more neutral here. Josephine?
Thank you. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So project timeline and key milestones. I'm not going to talk through this. I just thought you might like to print it and put it on your study wall as we work our way through this project over the next couple of years. So that's for later. But generally, if we go on to the next slide, if we have, if there's any feedback on the actual project timeline in the paper, thank you.
Any feedback on the timeline? Seen no hands. Julie?
Really quick, but Josephine, on the track 2, I just was reflecting on the 90-day there and wondering if that was, I suppose it's a little bit dependent on what track 2 ends up being from a scope perspective, but I just wondered if that one might need a little bit more time because it's track 2.
Yeah, thank you. Fair point.
Okay. No other hands.
Okay.
Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. Just a couple quick things. Back to the prior section, just don't forget about ISA 800 when we're putting in 2410 as a consider. And then for the timeline, when I looked at this laid out in track 1 and track 2, I thought maybe we should put in the actions table, track 1 and track 2, so it's clear.
Sorry, Wendy, Kalina's going to come in, and because I haven't got my hearing aids and I can't hear what she's saying to me, sorry.
Yes, just very briefly, that when we presented all the requirements that would be considered under track 2, we included the 800 series. That was in October, not 2410.
Okay.
Okay, if we can have the next slide then. Last chance, question number 2. Any other matters you want us to consider as we finalize this project proposal? Have been raised already?
It's a small one. It was when I was doing the outreach around this, the subject of group audits came up, and you know, particularly when you've got a pie buried somewhere in the depths of the group, how that impacts, you know, the audit report. You know, if we don't go down the audit report route, how that impacts the audit reports in different parts of the group. So that was just something for consideration.
Wendy, I think that your tent is up from last time, right? Okay. Back to you, Josephine.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. I wonder, that might be something we put on our hints and tips. Yeah, okay, brilliant. So we've got 4 things on there already, building up. Thank you. Okay, so Tom, that actually concludes the first part of our session. The next part is the exciting auditor's report mechanism. So did you want to take a break now? Or?
No, I don't want to take a break now. We're only 50 minutes in. We'll earn our breaks here.
Okay. All right, thanks. Michelle, if I could have the next slide, please. So we've got a little bit more here to set us all up. So we did agree in October that we would explore transparency of the auditor's report as part of track 1. As I've mentioned already, the proposals for enhancing and clarifying the standard and the auditor's report are set out. And then other mechanisms, of course, of public disclosure are not in the IAASB's mandate, so the transparency report or website, but we'll probably talk a little bit more about that as we open up this discussion. And as I said as well, if we conclude, or if our stakeholders do not support and we conclude that the auditor's report is not an appropriate mechanism, then it is actually to IAASB who will issue guidance or even propose conforming amendments. And that's also in their basis of conclusion as well. So they have made a, if you like, a public statement about that. If we have the next slide, please.
I'm not sure I understand.
Ever so sorry.
Series, did I not understanding you?
My Siri's awfully stupid. So I'm just going to put this away. Actually, interesting story. Sally Ann always sets off my Siri. For some reason, it thinks that when Sally Ann's talking, it's me. So I have to be very careful when Sally Ann's nearby. Right, so the three exciting options, of course, we have the first one. So if there are specific independent requirements for certain types of entities that the auditor needs to apply, then in all circumstances, the auditor would disclose that fact in their auditor's report. Option number 2 is that the disclosure of that fact is only relevant if the relevant ethical requirements require that disclosure in the auditor's report. And then option 3 is the application material route that will explain how the auditor might address the situation if the relevant ethical requirements require the auditor to disclose that fact. So those are the 3 options that are presented to you in the issues paper, which is paragraphs 37 through 48. And if we could move to the next slide, we're on to question number 4. We're moving up now. So we would like your views on options 1 to 3. I just want a slight caution that everybody will have a different opinion or may have similar opinions on which option they prefer personally. But what's important is first of all, the drafting for each option that's outlined, whether there are other options, some of which we've talked about already, that should be considered, but particularly around the auditor's report and 700, and also how many options should we present, whether multiple options should be presented, and if we do present them, which ones should we present? So again, understand you all have a favorite. That's that we understand that, but really if we can focus on the drafting, any other options you thought about, and also what should be presented, and that would be fantastic. Thank you. Tom.
Okay, and I think also we should consider the fact that we did get pretty substantive CAG input as it relates to option 3, or the exclusion of option 3 as a non-real option. So what we're asking for, and is not whether you agree, you have a preference between 1, 2, or 3. It's whether we're capturing the right options to put forward for the exposure draft, or are there alternatives that are to these, or a slight different articulation of these options? So we'll seek input on that. Isabel.
Yes, thank you. When we prepared for this meeting in France, our preference was option 3, because that's the only one that allows another solution than the auditor's report. So for the reason I outlined when reacting after Sue's comment, if we want to explore something else, we need option 3, because that's the only one that allows not to have a requirement in the auditor's report. Then I have 2 comments. One is on what we have included in all options in paragraph A35, little a. We have written, relevant ethical requirements may require the auditor to publicly disclose that independence requirements for audit of financial statements of certain entities were applied. And it's true, it's the way we write application material, we always use a may. But if we go back to the assurance framework or to ISA 200, we remind that to perform an assurance engagement or an audit, you need to have you need to apply ethical rules that are at least as demanding as the ISBA code. So then in that situation, can we say relevant ethical requirement may require? Because if you need to have requirements at least as demanding, they will always require, because they need to be at least as demanding as the ISBA code. So I was struggling with that. And my second comment is on the reference we made in the auditor's report in option 1 and 2 for the reference to ISBA code. And we say International Ethics Standard Board of Accountants, International Code of Ethics for Professional Accountants, quote, including international independent standard applicable to public interest entities. But my issue with that is that we used to have was the title of the code. The title of the code has now the quote, including international independent standard. And my understanding is that ISBA has not changed the title of the code. So I don't know how we can refer in italics to international independent standard applicable to public interest entities, because they are not in the title of the code, nor in a chapter of the code. So we seem to have changed we seem to have changed the title of the code. So there should be another way of referring to it. Thank you.
Okay, as well, just for clarification, even though we're not asking for preferences here, your point on option 3 is that despite the advice, for those who do have a preference, it's the only way to having it in the consultation to solicit opinion on that point, right? So therefore, you would suggest that there's an inclusion of it and not an exclusion.
Yeah, my point was it's the only option that allows for alternative for the communication, because the other ones have a requirement for the auditor's report, so it's not.
Right. So again, I just was pointing out that's not, we're not taking down a preference here, but it's a way to solicit opinion on those who would have that point of view. Okay. I'm going to call it Sachika. It's your first time today.
Thank you very much, Tom. And because this is my first time today, thank you very much, Josephine, and your team on your tremendous work. I have 2 comments in regards to options. The first point is about the need for clarification about the intent of the option, because I spoke with practitioners in Japan before the meeting about the option, and I found that in some cases, the intent of each option was not always understood, especially the difference between option 1 and option 2. For example, one interpretation I heard was that option 1 requires disclosure for all of the entities which are defined as pi in the code, and the other entities which the firm has treated them as pi in accordance with the code. On the other hand, option 2 only requires disclosure for the other entities which the firm has treated them as pi. And the other interpretation, including of course me, was that the difference between option 1 and 2 are whether the relevant requirement, relevant ethical requirement has a requirement to disclose the fact or not. And in addition, there's others who couldn't understand the intent of option 1 and 2. I think perhaps this ambiguity came from the explanation in paragraph 37 in the issue paper and the draft requirements for option 1 and 2. I am sorry, I do not have any wording suggestion right now, but I think perhaps it would be helpful if working group takes a look at wordings to make them more understandable, because at least in my jurisdiction, people do not understand them easily. I think it is important to explain more clearly the intent of the options, and so that the people can understand them easily, particularly in the exposure draft. And the second point is about the wording of the draft requirements of 28 small c for option 1 and 2. they both refer to certain entities and suggest the supporting application material could explain what is meant by certain entities. But I think it should refer to PI instead of certain entities in the requirements, because we are discussing the disclosure in the auditor's report, taking into consideration the IAASB requirement for a firm to disclose when the firm has applied independence requirement for PIs. I think the focus of this discussion is on PI, because I am concerned that the term certain entity could be interpreted broadly and have some unintended consequences that is not, expected by the code. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Adam.
Yes, thank you, Tom. And and I'll start with C, whether multiple options should be presented. And I haven't gone back to other exposure drafts, but I thought the exposure draft would just set out what the new requirements would be, rather than to solicit discussion on various options. I think that's what discussion papers are for. So I'm probably more in the camp of there is one option that is presented in the exposure draft. That's the option that the board wants. Then I had exactly the same comment as Isabel in respect of the italic text applicable to public interest, suggesting it is in the title. So we could take that bit out and add behind it as applicable to public interest entities, and that would solve it. Thank you.
Fernando.
Thank you, Tom, and hello, everyone. Hearing to what Sachiko said, I agree that we also struggle a little bit with how it's gonna work in practice. The general feedback from people in Latin countries was that they were not really quite sure whether option 1 or 2 was the preference. But I have to say that, and just to be clear, we're not saying we don't care, but honestly, I think we are going to be very flexible and accommodate the needs of the whole world. So whatever works better for other countries, I think we can make it work for our different jurisdictions. So I'm in favor of presenting a series of options that actually solve the issue to the need of those countries that really are looking for this topic, and we'll just move forward with whatever is decided at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Lynn?
Good morning, everybody. I support putting the 3 options forward. I have a preference for one of them, but I think at this stage, the 3 options is a sensible approach. On the drafted 28C, which is in paragraph 39, I struggled with understanding the last sentence there. I thought it could be written more easily. So, and I think that would help people understanding option 1. So other than that, I support what's in the paper, and I also support the project proposal. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Diane?
I overall support the 3 options. I am completely on the same page as Sachiko, which is I had to read option 1 and 2, and not the brightest bulb, but I had to read it several times to make sure I absolutely understood what the difference was. And so if there's anything you can do to clarify that, and I understand what the difference is, but it took me a while to get that from the words as it's written. So any type of clarifying points that you could put in there, I think would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks, Tom. Similar to Sachiko and others, my stakeholders did struggle with just the distinction between the different options and the implications of each. In terms of the question C around the multiple options, I'm afraid I'm in the camp of the board putting forward what it believes the standard should be, and if the discussion paper discusses different options that you considered as you went through that process, I think that's fine. Because what worries me is that if you give 3 options, you're going to get 3 groups of answers supporting the different options, and then you're going to be back at square one in terms of deciding what to do next. So I'm just not sure that putting 3 options is going to be an optimal solution. With respect to option 1 in paragraph 28C, and maybe this is where Lynn was coming from, there's a reference in there about the auditor has determined it appropriate to apply the specific independence requirements in the circumstances. And I think, Josephine, at the start of the meeting, you said that IAASB intends that if you are in that situation, you're going to have to disclose anyway. So I just wondered whether we could just delete those words altogether and just leave it as if you've used those requirements, then you have to disclose. And because I think that was part of the confusion people were finding. I had the same comment as Edo and Isabel around the actual wording of the illustrative report. I think Edo's suggestion addressed that question. On option 2, there were 2 different requirements given, and one of them, this is for 28, and it said in 28C1, and I'm not sure where we're going to end up with those, but in that second option that was provided, it suggested that the auditor would state the specific independence requirements that were applied. And that to me sounded like the auditor would have to list the independence requirements that had been applied, as opposed to just saying, we've applied all of the independence requirements. I think my final comment would just be in option 3. I think we've had some really good suggestions this evening that might mean we need to look at option 3 and maybe attack it from a slightly different perspective. But I thought it was a useful option to consider as part of this project, even though it does suffer from some of the disadvantages that others have identified. Thanks.
Thank you. Kai?
Thank you. Thank you to the working group for the preparation of the documents. I think similar to the ones we had yesterday, these are clear to understand what the intent is. I think following up on some of the comment on the discussion around option 1 and 2 and difficulties understanding, and then also on Eric's point on if there are too many choices when we go out on ED, should we have one example showing how this could be dealt with in the auditor's report, and the other one being along the lines of what Isabel said, if there's an alternative to that. So more trying to nail down to one and the other alternative being not tackled in the auditor's report. So we get a little bit more direction on the ED itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Warren?
Thanks, Tom. Maybe to start off, iterating the point that Josephine raised about option 3 being the sort of catch-all. I mean, sort of following from the discussion of saying the only mechanism really for us to consider is the audit report. So if you find yourself then in the world of option 3, what would the application actually be? And then when you had a read, or I had a read through 35A as the proposed illustration of what the application material would look like, it doesn't really seem to sort of provide much by way of guidance or insights. So perhaps then option 3 needs to, as I said originally, contain the basis where we would explore those alternate mechanisms and then effectively put the ball back in IAASB's court to decide how best to deal with those disclosure requirements were you to find stakeholders that are not actually of the view that option 1 or option 2 were favorable. And so I suppose in that sense, I'm in favor then of having the 3 options. Specifically then with respects to option 1 and 2, if we've got this idea of, and for brevity, I'm going to just talk about disclosure in the context of PI, although I understand the confusion about certain entities. But if we're saying that this independence disclosure is required to enable transparency, and you have a disclosure that then says something to the effect of this entity is a PI, and that therefore I have complied with these provisions of the IAASB code, it sort of begs the question, well, do you then need to explain in the audit report what a public interest entity is and how you arrived at the conclusion that this thing is a public interest entity? Or alternatively, if it's a certain entity, but not a public interest entity, would you need to explain what that other type of entity is? And again, the judgment and decision-making process you went through in order to conclude that it is this special type of entity, which therefore triggered the application of these special provisions in the IAASB code. Because really, if the interest is in transparency, in my mind, you can't have the one without the other. There also seems to be the presumption in option 1 and 2 that transparency and useful means the same thing. That somehow by providing more disclosure, you make the audit report transparent and that is automatically useful. And I do take the point, I can understand that logic. But if we do have option 1 and 2, I think that there should be something in there that explains that you're probably looking for something more than just type of generic boilerplate disclosure. Otherwise, in the interest of transparency, all that we're really doing is just adding a very sort of vague sentence about compliance with whatever paragraphs in the IAASB code or other relevant code, as might actually be the case. Also, as a sort of a general point, coming back to that comment by SMPAG about not wanting to create the impression that you have audits of different quality or that you have audits carried out according to different risk assessments or different responses to those risks. If you now have 2 audit reports and the one audit report, let's say both companies are in the same industry, the one happens to be a PI, the other one is not necessarily a PI. You now have 2 audit reports. One has this additional independence disclosure requirement in it. The other one does not have this independence disclosure requirement in it. If there could be some sort of explanation in option 1 and 2 of how we therefore mitigate the risk that in our desire to enhance transparency, we do exactly that. We do actually run that key issue of creating the impression that these 2 audit reports are somehow different, or that the one has been carried out to a more rigorous standard or a more sort of thorough diligence, if you will, than another. And then the final sort of observation I had just with respects to the 3 options was sort of thinking about independence. And Josephine, I think I did raise this with you originally. To what extent would option 1 and 2, or perhaps even all 3 of them, create a situation where there are perpetual additions being added to the audit report? So, I mean, today we're talking about independence and this very narrow scope amendment, to take Willie's point about it being a narrow scope amendment related to PI and the quality control standard, ISQM1, but then it sort of has implications for the auditor's report. And in the interest of transparency, we want to make a comment about independence, and I understand that. But then similarly, could we eventually envisage a situation where we have similar options dealing with, say, professional competence or due care? Because those are also fundamental principles in the IAASB code, which are not currently dealt with explicitly, I suppose, in ISQM1 or explicitly in the audit report. Thank you very much.
I guess I feel like I need to come in here, Warren, because the one thing I would say is that IAASB ran a full due process where we obviously have control over what's in the auditor's report, but they did basically ask the question of whether transparency about independence requirements. They did not specify where in the requirements, though they remember at first they suggest the auditor's report, but they did not want to tie our hands to it. So they have had some user feedback on this topic. So I guess to me, I just don't want to forget that the requirements in the IAASB code has been subject to some due process here. I take your point that it's up to us to determine whether it's appropriate in the auditor's report and what would be a useful way to do it. But I guess what I don't want to give a sense is that we would be second guessing the IAASB judgment about the benefits of transparency about the enhanced, I guess, confidence provided by the PI selection. And that I just wanted to be clear on that point for this board, where we end up from a preferred position, a consultant position is another issue. But the one thing, we either accept the IAASB due process and the outcome to it, or we have another question at hand for us. And I also accept the fact, Warren, that you weren't part of this debate so previously, but I do think it should be acknowledged that IAASB has run a process to come to a conclusion that there should be some transparency around independence requirements as it relates to PI. Diane, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, I just want to come in here. I think Warren's point is a fair point. I guess what I'm suggesting is he's raising a question that says, yes, there needs to be something in the auditor's report. That's the path we're going down. I think he's asking us a fair challenge, which is, what exactly are we going to say? Right? That's a different conversation. And so I just want to clarify. I think what Warren is saying is, great, we have to make a disclosure, but let's just pause and say, is what we're suggesting going to do the trick? Is it going to improve transparency, or is it a throwaway sentence? And I think that's a fair challenge. So I just offer that up, and maybe there's more to it that goes with it, but I think that's kind of the spirit of which the question was raised.
I totally welcome that discussion, because that is this question of what we consult on. I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't a question of if there should be transparency, because I think IAASB has gone down that road already. And so if I misinterpreted Warren's comments, I apologize. But Warren, is your position what Diane said, or?
Yes, Tom. So maybe just to clarify here, I'm not disputing the fact that the disclosure enhances transparency. I think that that's almost axionomical. But what I am saying is exactly what Diane is suggesting. Yes, this provides additional transparency. That makes perfect sense to me, and I'm not disputing that. But then the question is, all right, so now you put in this additional disclosure, whatever it happens to look like. And that could still be transparent because you're providing more information. But does providing more information give our stakeholders something that's necessarily useful? And that, we could end up in a situation where auditors over a period of time end up with, exactly as Diane put it, I like the phrase, a sort of a throwaway sentence or a generic paragraph that just gets replicated year after year after year in the audit reports. And I don't think that that's sort of the long-term objective of what we're trying to achieve. But I do understand that IAASB did a due process. I do understand that they want to enhance transparency. And I do agree that providing extra information in an audit report provides extra transparency. I'm just saying that we should take perhaps a medium and a longer term view while we have the opportunity to do so.
Josephine?
Tom, your point is spot on, and it actually goes further. In fact, part of that consultation feedback that they received was matters around Warren was raising. So, for example, originally when the consultation went out, it said that the auditor would disclose that they had treated the entity as a PI. The feedback that they actually got was that was a very uncomfortable place to auditors, because to your point, Warren, what does it mean to be treated as a PI or treat an entity as a PI? And therefore also now we have to describe in our auditor's report what a PI is. And that was the one area of the feedback we got when we talked about the auditor's report and disclosing it there, where people were extremely uncomfortable. So through that process, and I do recognize you weren't part of it, so it's not particularly fair, but through that process then, IAASB moved from using that language, treated as a PI, which made many stakeholders uncomfortable, So building it more about the statement of fact, because it is a statement of fact. It is that you have applied those independent requirements that are relevant to those entities. And that's where we got to a much more comfortable position in our own mind, as well as a board, that it would be an extension of the statement of fact that we already make. And it would then resolve IAASB's concern that they really wanted to have this enhanced transparency. So I totally understand the need for when we're thinking carefully about making changes that would impact the auditor's report, we have to think about the usefulness of users. But in this particular instance, we've already come down a direction where what would be better from the stakeholders' perspective is just to have that statement of fact in there rather than have additional explanation. And so I just wanted to add that piece as well, because that was all part of the consultation as well, and the feedback we received.
Okay, I thought this was an important point. Anyone responded? I think probably almost everyone's responded directly to this, but Sue, you want to come in on this continuation of that? Warren, I don't want to cut you off. If this is probably the first time you've heard that background, so if you want to come in, allow you. But I think basically your admonition is to be thoughtful about the way we draft any requirements as it goes to the auditor's report, and make sure that it's having its intended long-term impact. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, Tom, it is a fair statement. And also, Josephine, on the point about, not specifically referring to the pie, yes, I do recall reading that somewhere in one of the packs that I was sent. But I suppose the retort there would be, if you refer to a specific part or a specific independence requirement of the IAASB code, it's not inconceivable that a diligent reader of that audit report would go look up that section of the IAASB code and say, well, hold on a second, this section of the IAASB code applies to this particular type of entity, and our audit report doesn't explain how you got to that particular type of entity. So it would almost be indirectly or reverse engineering the type of entity that you have based on the fact that you've referred now to specific sections of the code, assuming that that's what the disclosure looks like.
Okay. So
I'm going to change tack. I had some thoughts on option 3, and I take Isabel's point that it's the only option that considers alternatives. I was also thinking that option 3 isn't necessarily mutually exclusive to the others, because, for example, you could have jurisdictional disclosure in relation to listed companies, but not in relation to other pies. So if we could perhaps consider that as we're going through. On the phrase certain entities, I also stumbled over that like Sachiko, but actually from a completely opposite perspective, in that by using the example of pies, I was concerned that perhaps prejudges the outcome of the discussion about whether we're going to adopt that phraseology. So my preference would have been to drop the example, but I do hear Sachiko's concern. So perhaps we could look at that phrase. And then, like others, a request for greater clarity on the difference between options 1 and 2, and particularly the difference on what it means, for example, in the audit reports, if at all. Thank you.
okay, thank you, Julie.
Thank you. Back to the questions on your slide, Josephine. So, and I also read and reread and read again options 1 and 2, and I'll admit I got there to what they meant and the differences, but anything we can do to help explain that, I think, would be helpful. On your first question about the drafting, the one I got a little bit stumped on was option 2 of option 2, because the option, sorry, I gotta stop using the word option. The first alternative under option 2 made sense in accordance with how you described option 2 above. The second one, I wasn't sure how that worked, because in reading it, it felt like we were identifying the relevant ethical requirements and on and on. And then the second part, and then refer to IAASB. And I thought, why would you do both? Wouldn't you just refer to the relevant ethical requirements? It read to me like you were referring to your relevant ethical requirements and the fact you need to disclose something publicly, and then also referring to IAASB at the same time. So is there an or missing there, or an either, or in the drafting for that? So that was my drafting comment. I didn't have other options, but I do have some sympathy for the and I think some support for what's been described as a preferred option by the board and the alternative option, which would be, so in essence, you would have two. I suppose you'd have the preferred option of the board for the auditor's report, and then a second option for the alternative. So that's really my answer to B and C at the same time.
Okay, well, I think we'll have to turn to the sort of strategic approach of whether there's a preferred option or not after this round. I'm not afraid to have people express their opinion on it, but I think we'll have to come to a conclusion on that. Yosh?
Thank you, Tom. Chair. At first, I agree with the working group's proposal of 3 options, as it is more useful and broad-based to obtain opinions from any stakeholders at first. And I don't want to discuss about the transparency, but the under ISO 700, the title of the audit report is already required to include description of the independent auditor's report. And in addition, the statement which the audit was conducted in accordance with the IAASB code, which includes comprehensive independence requirements. So in order to ensure the clarity and understandability of the audit report, as mentioned by the CAG, without complexity, the working group should be cautious not to make the audit report excessively long or redundant due to statements without information value or without information content for the decision making by intended users. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. Bill?
Thanks, Tom. Look, it's the first comment I've made, and in doing so, I just wanted to congratulate the working party on putting together the project proposal. It is a project proposal, and I think most of the comments I would have raised have been raised. So I just wanted to give that the concurrence. I think that there aren't too many issues here are problematic. I'm relaxed on which options are carried forward. I support the fact that there should be an option other than the audit report. But beyond that, again, congratulations. Really, I think the biggest part was getting the PI definition, and the work that was done with IAASB before getting to this project proposal should be complimented as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Wendy, is your 10 up?
Thank you, Tom. I just wanted to clarify something that I had said earlier. I did struggle with 1 and 2 and did read them a few times and put them side by side. But in the end, I understood what the intent was. And I had said earlier that I don't think we need more than 1 and 2, but I do think 3 there should be an option for responders to say, if not one of these 2 options, what is the option? But when I was saying that before, I meant outside of the auditor's report, if there's another option that people want to propose. So I think these are the only 2 options for the auditor's report. And I struggled from an ED perspective. You know, we have track 1 and track 2, so we haven't really decided what's going in the ISAs and the definition of public interest entities. But given the urgency, because the requirement says the firm has to publicly disclose it, I mean, that's where we are. So there's not an option not to. So I think that if we go out with 1, which I understand that's a prior protocol for exposure drafts, we're still going to get a lot of different responses. So I feel that we need to bucket them to get the responses, that we can then address in putting together a standard. I'm confusing you, I see. No. And so therefore, I'm okay with putting out a 1 and a 2 option in an exposure draft, even though an exposure draft is supposed to be the final standard, which is not different than what we did in LCE.
Right. To some extent, we did that on the group audit section of LCE. I'm not sure that there's a hard and fast rule about having to have a specific preference on the ED. What I think is the question is that Eric raised is, will we get better feedback? Where I think Ada said, if we choose one versus the other and indicate a preference. But my understanding of our due process is, in fact, to get to final, we actually have to have something proposed that we could react to and therefore be the basis of a final proposal. Whether it's we express a preference or not, it actually is not totally in line with our due process. Not Billy, would you concur with that due process opinion?
The important point from due process is to make sure that we get the comments on the board's position. Now, in this case, the board's position could be that there are 2 options. The thing that you don't want is if we decide on something we did not deliberate on, that we did not get input on, that's going to be a basis for re-exposure and that type of thing. So as long as we get the input on, on what we think the options are, then it should be fine, because whatever one we decide on is we have consulted on that option.
That was my understanding. So, Ada?
I was going to challenge that a little bit, Billy. I had understood that as part of our due process, and when you vote for the exposure draft, you need to vote as if that exposure draft would be a standard, and standard cannot have 3 options.
Yeah, and Ada, you're completely right. That is what the due process says. And I think the ethics board, I can't remember when, it was a few years back, had a challenge on something they had to put out. And I think, one of the things that's important is we need to remember that our exposure draft is our facility to obtain comments. And that's things will change from exposure draft to final. The important thing is that we've deliberated everything, that we've put everything in the public domain, and that we've got comments on that.
If the board were to express this clear preference for an option, we could do that. Like, I have a clear preference to it, but that's not what we were asked here for. It's possible we may decide in June whether there's a preference or not, or we could figure something out in between. But in my mind right now, what I'm hearing from you, let's talk about the options, and whether there's a preference is another question, and whether we want to go down that path is another question. Is that 1 and 2, there's some suggestions about clarity. I had to read 1 and 2 a couple of times to understand the difference between 1. Anything we could do, Len, sorry. So Len will probably come in and maybe even give more clarity to this, but we have to be clear on what those options are. As it relates to 3, what people are most interested in is if there is alternatives to the auditor's report, how to get information on that and solicit feedback. Eric gave a suggestion, as I remember, is that maybe there's a different way of coming at it. Wendy sort of gave that the same as, if you agree with neither of these options at the auditor's report, maybe there's a follow-up question in our explanatory memorandum on this point. So that's another alternative. So in that world, in fact, we're narrowing effectively maybe to 1 and 2 anyway as a preference. So that may make it easier for us. And then as we would go thinking about this is, what are the implications that we would be for an explanatory memorandum that would have to describe some of why we got to where we are. And I think it seems to me in this instance, there's a lot of context that we even needed to remind the board of in the explanatory memorandum that would need to go with the CD as well. Len, I didn't mean to preempt you.
No, I think everything you said is actually along the line I was going to say. So I'm not going to repeat that. So I think Edo, I think you're right. I think in the ED you have a board's position, but it's in the explanatory memorandum you have questions. As far as in the ED yourself, you have 3 options. I think that's how I look at it. So how we present the options. But just for a record that I'm not a proponent of option 1. So just to do that. But I also just to note, Edo, I think we're all on the same page. But I think Tom is right. Is how we present that the options, whether it's posed as a question or in the explaining memorandum, how we decide to get feedback. Thanks.
So I saw Edo, you put your hand up, and I cut us off from a break earlier. You've now earned your break. But I would come back to you, Edo, after the break. I think we need a 15-minute break here. I would say we reconvene at 5 minutes to the hour, and then we'll try to bring some of these thoughts together and respond. We'll give Edo the opportunity to come back in if he'd like. But I think we need to give the working group, soon to be a task force, once we approve the project proposal, some guidance on how to develop the exposure draft. And so that means what options we're going to present? Are we going to express a preference? How do we deal with option 3 if we don't have if we're going to express a preference that doesn't include that? So I'll give the task force about working group 15 minutes to think through some of these questions. We'll come back and we'll get to some conclusions. Okay, could we start to reconvene? Okay, just give us a few seconds. Sorry for those who are online, your patience for waiting with us. The working group was coming up with an option for us. They had to convince a very skeptical chair. We're waiting for a couple more people. Okay, Michelle, are we back online? Okay. I beg your forgiveness. The working group has been hard at work, and maybe this will react unless you want to have an intervention beforehand. Josephine and the team, having heard all the diversity of viewpoints over the last hour or so, wanted to come up with something for the board to react to as a path forward on this. The goal would be to elicit clear opinion from our stakeholders. So Josephine, back to you.
Thank you, and thanks as well to the working group for their prompt attack at this, and thanks to the board for all your comments. There were some other comments raised that I can talk about at some point, but in terms of this issue and making sure that we're ready for June. So our proposal is that today we will ask the board to vote on their preferred option out of option 1 and option 2, because we've also taken into account our CAG advice and comments on this. We think, as Sue had mentioned, we think that the option 3 is really going to be the story in the explanatory memorandum about if of the mechanism that we've offered here, you're not supportive as a stakeholder, then what other mechanisms for publicly disclosing that information would you suggest? And then we can give that information to IAASB if we end up down a path where that seems to be the general direction. So it's option 1 and option 2. Also in the explanatory memorandum, to the point made earlier, we will put some context in why we've arrived where we've arrived, in terms of also the difference between treated as a pie and the statement of fact and so forth. So that's a bit more context for people. And we'll also explain, so if, for example, the board chose option 1, we'd also still put option 2 as in the explanatory memorandum to explain that this was also another option that we looked at. And therefore, stakeholders have full transparency about what our conversation was about and what we were trying to discuss and agree on. So hopefully, I'm getting nods, hopefully that's a good way forward. And then the other thing I just want to say before we move on to the vote, if you like, is that we also had a brief discussion about the interim reviews and 2400. And of course, as rightly pointed out, this would extend the scope of this project and also potentially change this explanatory memorandum. We are going to pop back to our pals at IAASB and have a conversation about this and understand what their intent was with that transparency requirement and whether they had intended it to be extended beyond audits, irrespective of the glossary. And so we're absolutely crystal clear on that point before we start putting forward ideas to the board to discuss on that particular area, particularly as we haven't opened 2410 for 100 years, notwithstanding I know it needs to be opened, but there we are. So that's it, Tom, back to you. Thank you.
Well, how would you like to do this? Would you like people to express a preference on the option now?
Yes, I think, and then
Okay.
that way because we want to get something to you in June with everything ready to go.
For those who express, and for those who are online on Zoom, you could use digital hands and I'll count you up. For those who have a preference for option 1, please raise your hand. So 1, 2, 6. Okay. For those who have a preference for option 2, raise your hand. 7. Yeah, I think it. Yep, 12. And things add up. We're still 18. Okay, I imagine we'll have a fulsome description of option 1 and 2 and the pros and cons with the preference for option 2 in the explanatory memorandum.
Okay, thank you very much. So just popping back to a couple of comments I did want to just pick on. Sachiko said that there was difficulty understanding the term certain entities. Sachiko, we use that in our standards already. In fact, we have that in 210 and 540. But I think your point was that we could, if we use that language, we could probably also have a little bit of additional application material to explain it further, which is sort of what we've done also in ISA 540. So I think that's an easy fix. Also, we can't necessarily make reference such a code to pi because we have to be neutral, even though in our standards we're neutral about relevant ethical requirements, but we do sometimes reference IAASB because it's a good example of actually expressing the point that we're making either in the application material or supporting a requirement. But because of that neutrality, it would be relevant to certain entities. We can't just specifically focus on pies in that case. And also, if we were to do that, then we might have to go down, we would extend track 1 because then we'd have to think about whether we now have to actually define pies as part of track 1. And it's very important that we define pies or consider the definition of pies part of track 2. So to that extent, and maintaining neutrality, which is the key point here, I think we'd rather stick to just using that terminology. Thank you. And I think that was it. It was the only other points were about clarity about the options. And are you thumbs up me or Ado?
I'm thumbing. I'll give it to you too, Josephine. Good job. But I asked him whether he took his tent down intentionally.
Yeah, and thank you for the wording solution, ADO, in A35C. For those of you who had solutions for wording, I think, Julie, you also made a couple of points. If you wouldn't mind sending this to us, I mean, Kalina's doing a marvelous job of getting everything down, but sometimes, you know, we might miss something. So if you could send those along to us, we'd really appreciate it. And I think that was it. Yeah, those are the only points. That was the only points on this, so we can move on now. Any comment just before I move on to the next?
Edda?
Yeah, I just wanted Josephine to finish answering questions, but I'm still a little bit, so that's great that we now voted on option 1 and 2. And I think what I got from Len was that he seemed to, and from Willie, that there was agreement that the exposure draft should be as explicit as possible, and that the explanatory memorandum is the place for discussing how the various options were weighed. But I would still be in favor of one option. That's which is the board's position. That will be in the exposure. Is that the intent? Because then I'm entirely happy.
Yeah, that's absolutely the intent. So we will put option 2 forward as our preferred option as a board, but the explanatory memorandum will explain the fact we did discuss other approaches and we'll express like option 1 from that perspective. And then we'll also have a piece in the explanatory memorandum that then helps with that second part, which is if you don't believe the auditor's report is the right mechanism, then what do you think would be the mechanism to publicly disclose this information? And then that piece we would package and give to IAASB, because if we were in that situation where there wasn't support, it would be up to IAASB to take it forward. Yeah? Okay.
Billy?
Yeah, just adding to what Josephine has said, we will present option 1 also in the context of indicating that the CAG had a strong preference for option 1, because we do think both option 1 and 2 operationalizes the IAASB requirement. Option 1 we would like to still have in there because we do think it brings an additional level of consistency across reports and probably a stronger nod to the public interest. But so you're quite right. We'll put option 2 as that's the proposal, but we will also articulate the other option in the EM.
Okay, Billy, you still have your card up. Do you have a question? Thank you very much. Okay, so if we could move to the next slide, still some more to do. Sorry, I won't keep you too much longer. So if you recall in October, we also talked about the fact that it would be important for the auditor to communicate to those charged with governance the fact that they are going to make a disclosure in the auditor's report and that specific independence requirements for certain entities have been applied. In terms of the advice at the time, it was probably more natural to look at paragraph 16 of ISA 260 because that deals with the statement that you make about your independence as an auditor. But having noodled on it a little bit longer, which is Dan's word, which I've stolen forever, paragraph 16D.
Here reflected our discussions at the CAG meeting, and we've already discussed the 3 options and narrowing it down to 1 and 2, because that was a source. Also, just the whole issue, which we've sort of talked around, of complexity or making it confusing, and being aware of that as you move forward with your proposal. Thanks.
Janine, any reflections you'd like to share?
Yes, as PIOB, I think we consider enhanced transparency and consistency as important in the public interest. So also sufficient input from investors and other users of the audited financial statements, in particular on the transparency, on the independence, is very key, I think, in this project. So thanks.
Thank you, Janine. Any other reflections before I turn it back to Josephine for any concluding remarks? Okay, you're done. So I think we're in good shape on this project. And so I remember you will get the updated proposal for project proposal for approval. Is this one by Monday. The other one's by Friday. So, okay. And then one other thing I mentioned yesterday for the virtual meeting on Wednesday afternoon US time, that we may need to move our discussion forward by a half hour. That is now the case. We will start at 3:30 Eastern time. So mark that down on your calendar. European commissions who are public observers to our board will participate in that early part of the session to discuss updates from a European perspective on sustainability reporting. To us, this is really important too, because it may drive some of our considerations on timing and scope of work that we're doing. So please mark that down on your calendars. Billy, our staff team, anything you'd like to add?
Tom, I'm just looking at Michelle. I know we had some arrangements for food because we thought we were going to finish at 7:30. So will that still be delivered? Okay, okay, good.
Okay, well, exceptional job by the team again in preparing this meeting today and with the materials. Great conversation too. I think we dug deep on a lot of the key issues. I'm glad that we have a board preference. I think both Edo and Eric gave us a good nod in that direction, that we'll get better feedback that way. And I look forward to continuing our discussions tomorrow. And it's fraud. Anyone want to say, Lynn, do you have any preview for tomorrow?
No, I'm just looking forward to the discussion, and I'll see you all to talk about fraud in the morning for me.
Okay. Well, enjoy your day, Lynn, and good evening. Get some rest for those who it's at the end of their day, and successful evening here too. Thank you very much. Bye.